Here's a quiet village of Silverton, BC, with a nice old city hall there, village, with lots of interesting equipment. Here's some interesting equipment from the logging industry and also an extensive mining industry here. Here you've got hydraulic drills, various mining compressors. There's a big old winch. There's an ore car. Probably was down in a mine deep down many years ago. And here you've got some very interesting old, they look like pumps of some sort. And that there, at the end there, looks like a Pelton wheel. Probably came from a hydroelectric plant at one time. Lots of other interesting old pieces of mining equipment and to look at here. The wealth in this area was created by silver. This town has a very rustic frontier town look to it. Here's the main street, and you see a lot of the original false fronted buildings here. Here's what's left of the boom town of Sandon. This was a town of maybe 5,000 people in about 1900. And it was intact until about 1955, when there was an enormous amount of, I guess you'd call it a flash flood, and most of the town was built over this creek. And the creek overflowed and took away most of the buildings in the town. All that's left are what you see on the left here, and some further higher up. But this used to be a very intact town, complete town with saloons and bars and everything. And after the war, during the war, there was a Japanese internment camp here, and also at New Denver. Here you can see the City Hall, which is 1900, and some of the buildings here have been restored. And the biggest landowner here, the gentleman who has bought a whole lot of buses, old buses from Vancouver, and he's restoring them. And he hopes to, as he restores the buses, old 1950s and 40s buses, he is selling them to, or giving them to, museums all across Canada who want old buses. Here are a lot of the old buses, and to someone who grew up in Vancouver in the 1960s, these buses would be very familiar, as they still say the names of many of the streets. Here are some of the old buses that were familiar to people in the 50s and 60s. They say familiar Vancouver street names and names of places like Stanley Park. Here there was a railway that used to come up here into the mountains, and here's the old locomotive. Here's the old fire hall from about 1900.
I think you gotta come over and order. Oh yeah.
road up, you'll see two semi-trailers past the second one on the left.
Here's the story of this town and how it was all built on easily accessible silver and lead ore. One of the most interesting things about this town is the powerhouse. It's still going and generating electricity, and it's been going since the 1890s. It must be one of the oldest powerhouses in the world. Here's an interesting Forest Service road that is now closed, but it led all the way to the top of a mountain where there was an old fire service lookout for forest fires. Very scary road to drive up there. I did it a number of years back in a 4x4. Here's an ancient Pelton wheel, probably from the 1800s. And here we have an old Kenworth truck. Here's some ancient transformers, probably oil filled in the old days. Here's a 70-year-old Blackstone diesel made in England. Started up once a year as a backup generator. This generator, hydroelectric generator, has been going continuously since 1905. This room has a smell of oil, amazing smell of oil. Smell of oil that you'd expect in a place like this. Here are the more modern gauges and meters. And here are the old ones from around 1905 or thereabouts. And there you can see they're still they're selling power to the utility. The box on the top is the converter, so it can be sold to hydro. Here's the original gauges, shut-off breakers, still working, still reading amps and volts. Cars going out at 2400 volts. And it's producing about 205, 204 kilowatts. 204 kilowatts. This is the end of the hydroelectric unit, and these are Babbitt bearings that have been running since 1905, and all they have to do is add oil and shut it down for maintenance. This is the inside of the bearings. Here's the water valve for when there's too much water coming in, they can slow down the amount of water so that it doesn't overwhelm the Pelton wheels. Let's look at the size of these wheels. Unbelievable. This locomotive was built in 1908. It was built in the Montreal Locomotive Works, and I spent most of its life in Alberta. They encourage you to ring the bell, so here I am. This locomotive is what's called a 280. As well as the interesting locomotive, here's a beautiful coal tender. And also some freight cars. Very interesting. Completely privately owned and privately restored. Here's the Galena Bay Ferry, and it crosses the Arrow Lakes. It's about 5 miles wide at this point. Takes about half an hour to cross. The Arrow Lakes are a continuation of the Columbia River, where they widen out, and they're about 120 miles long, surrounded by very rugged mountains. And at Castlegar, there's a hydro dam that raised the level of the Arrow Lakes in 1966, creating the reservoir that you see today. The mountains on the left are called the Monashee Mountains, and the mountains on the right of the lakes are called the Selkirks.